obviously I'm the man from the video, and been on Monday and Tuesday spending a lot of time with some great people going through these topics in a very practical sense. So obviously, so I can change it from here, I guess. Going to be talking about these two critical aspects of increasing resilience in our supply chain. So supply chain risk management and, okay, this keeps falling off. Didn't do a risk assessment on this obviously before. And continuity management as well. But before actually going in there, I just want to sort of highlight that the key message of my presentation today is that increasing resilience is actually a strategic imperative with an increasing sense of urgency today. And to the details in terms of how I think risk management and business continuity management in the context of supply chains today needs to change. I'm just going to want to spend a moment going through why, I mean, that there is this sort of sense of urgency and that these things really need to be a strategic imperative. And the first argument is really that we already are in an age of uncertainty. The operating environment that we work on a daily basis is arguably more uncertain and complex than any time during our careers. I think most of you would actually agree with that. And a big part of that is because modern life is just so complex. So there's this sort of incredible interaction between human, technological, and environmental factors and very complex sort of interdependency between those different systems in order for everything to actually work out in the daily life and daily operations. When you combine that complexity with the dynamic change of today's business, I think I'm going to actually take this just in my hand, what we get is volatility and uncertainty. So just understanding what sort of affects what, and all these changes taking place so quickly, what we're going to be encountered by is increasingly surprises. So new type of events, but not only new type of events, but with new type of impacts. So even when we're experiencing events that are already familiar to us, the impacts may be very surprising. There's a lot of good examples from the past in supply chain disruptions where a very local disruption can cascade into global impacts. So this is the sort of a challenge. Most of you probably have heard at some point in time two sort of concepts that are discussed in a lot of in business literature and everyday sort of business life, and those are TUNA and VUCA. So TUNA stands for turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous, whereas VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So those are sort of complex sets of, I guess, concepts, but what these concepts try to communicate to us is that we're increasingly likely to encounter new and surprising shocks. So our past experiences help us probably less and less in terms of actually preparing for continuity of our business. The other sort of question is then, are we entering an area of uncertainty, or are we perhaps already there? COVID-19, the Evergreen incident at the Suez Canal in 2020, and the war in Ukraine are, of course, in everybody's minds in terms of this type of disruptions that can cause global impacts. And in the past, we had major events such as 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, or the floodings in Thailand that disrupted entire global supply chains. We don't know what the total impact of actually these events has been in dollar terms, but the scale is enormous. So just when COVID started, the UN, for instance, estimated that it would cause total global economic losses totaling around $8.5 trillion US. So that's the sort of scale we're talking about. Obviously, we recovered well from COVID and so forth, but the scale of these shocks can be obviously enormous. And these are not just yesterday's news. We already have had ships gotten stuck again in the Suez Canal. We will have new pandemics. And natural disasters and extreme weather events are most likely going to be more frequent and more impactful. McKinsey, for instance, estimated that the average across industries, companies can now expect supply chain disruptions lasting a month or longer to occur actually every 3.7 years. And 1 to 2 week disruptions can be expected every 2 years. So there's clearly sort of trend of increasing frequency of disruptions. But what about the impact? So as I said, the impact has been enormous in the past. It will be so also in the future. In the same report, for instance, McKinsey sort of pointed out that what's at play is roughly a quarter of global goods trade. So this could be around $4.4 trillion in total value. That is the scale we're discussing. So in some, disruptions are quite likely going to be more frequent, more surprising, and more impactful, at least unless we actually manage risks involved with our supply chains better and are better prepared for such surprising shocks. So what disruptive trends are we seeing at the moment? You're going to be hearing a lot about these during the conference, so I'm not going to go through these in any detail. But there's 4 that I would like to just briefly highlight as particularly timeful and impactful. And those are climate change and extreme weather events, geopolitical conflict and geoeconomic competition, disrupted global trade, and cyber threats and digital disruptions. The effects of climate change are definitely going to challenge supply chain continuity. The effects of climate change are sort of daily news, so I know you hear about this every day. The effects to our planet and humanity are going to be immense. And obviously, supply chains are not going to be an exception. The most direct impacts probably will come from increasing frequency of natural disasters and extreme weather events, but there will be system-level changes too in terms of when climate change has effect on demographics, on migration trends, and also infrastructures. So obviously that is going to change a lot in the operating environment of supply chains. As demonstrated by the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, major armed conflict as a threat has not disappeared anywhere. So for the first time since Second World War, we have a major geopolitical crisis, a major war taking place in Europe. There are the geopolitical risks in this region too. I know you will be hearing about them later, and so I'm not going to dwell into them. But besides armed conflict, the international system is increasingly challenged by geoeconomic competition. So the increasing use of economic means to achieve strategic political goals. So economy is being weaponized in many ways. You've seen this in the context of the war, for instance, in proliferation of different types of sanctions, export controls, and other trade restrictions, as well as investment screening, both inbound and outbound investments. This is also already very evident in the so-called decoupling between the United States and China, but also in the increasing pursuit of so-called strategic autonomy or self-sufficiency in Europe or elsewhere. And at the worst, geoeconomics will lead into the balkanization of the world economy, where competing blocks are increasingly disconnected from each other. And that extends to supply chain, critical supply chains as well. So the increasing weaponization of the economy also means that governments are more and more taking measures to protect national economies. And in that context, obviously, ensuring that the critical supply chains that support those national economies work under all conditions as well. Just earlier this week on Tuesday, the European Union released a new strategy for European economic security. And the 3 risks that they highlighted in that strategy were, number 1, resilience of supply chains. Number 2, physical and cyber security of critical infrastructures. And number 3, technological security and the leakage of technology as a risk. So the member states are actually now asked to deepen their analysis of critical supply chains and take measures to increase their resilience. That has happened also in this region. Japan actually released an Economic Security Promotion Act already last year, so in 2022. And that also includes a target for stabilizing supply of critical products and essential services and the supply chains that support those. So even if we don't, from our own selfish point of view, care about increasing resilience of supply chains, the governments are probably going to be forcing us to do so. And then finally, digitalization. Obviously, digitalization produces many benefits and new exciting opportunities, but it also increases vulnerability to cyber threats and digital disruptions in these systems that we increasingly rely on. The more dependent supply chains become on digital systems and data, the more impact loss in such areas actually is going to impact us. So there's many sort of exciting opportunities with, for instance, artificial intelligence or quantum technology, but there's also risks that we're simply not aware of yet. So there's again sort of that question of uncertainty. So in this disrupted world, there we go. Supply chain resilience actually really is becoming a strategic imperative. And supply chain risk management and supply chain continuity management are critical components of this imperative. So I'm going to be switching on now to the actual issues of supply chain risk management and continuity management and how those should actually evolve in order to respond effectively to challenges that I pointed out. So first of all, again, risk management is really the best known and most sort of tested means of reducing uncertainty. It doesn't eliminate it, but it is the way that we can actually reduce that uncertainty. As I pointed out, modern supply chains are complex, interconnected and interdependent networks where cascading and connected impacts cannot be ruled out and are harder and harder to actually predict and mitigate. So supply chain risk management must really be increasingly a holistic and a collaborative exercise that covers all critical elements of supply chains. And because of the dynamic change, this process really needs to be continuous and constantly improving process. Otherwise, we're always going to be behind the evolution of the risk itself. But even if we do risk management increasingly well, and even if we do it extremely well, disruptions are still possible and disruptions will still happen. So we need to be prepared also for these surprising shocks that we can't mitigate. And a validated capability to continue and recover critical functions following a shock is becoming a question of survival in this sense. Validated because it is something that we really need to be sure when we have business continuity plans, for instance, that we can actually truly, under all circumstances, execute them effectively. So a plan itself has never saved anyone. Our ability to execute that plan effectively can do that. But in addition to being a question of survival, it's also becoming a significant source of competitive advantage in this new environment where the difference is increasingly between those who thrive and those who fail. Right? So some of us will be thriving in this new environment, some of us will actually fail and go away, disappear. So together these two, again, can constitute the building blocks for developing, improving resilience. I'm a resilience scholar, but I'm not going to go into any details in that regard, but there are many definitions, there are many competing sort of understandings of what resilience actually means. I'm just going to point out a few elements, few capabilities that I think a resilient organization needs to have. And the first one is just the capability to anticipate shocks. So if we always taken by surprise of shocks emerging, we're probably not going to do very well, even if we have good planning, even if we have good business continuity management or risk management. And the second one is we need to be really strong enough to actually, robust enough to resist shocks also when they happen. So if we fail in the sort of first incident of a shock, then we're probably not going to be very resilient. Whatever, how good our plans are, shocks have very unexpected impacts usually. So the circumstances of our operations are going to change. So we have to be adaptive to those changes so that we can take advantage of the changes and not be actually terrorized by them. And then obviously we need to be able to recover effectively from the shock after it's over. But above all, we need to learn. We need to continuously learn from our experiences in the past in order to actually be better during future shocks. So it is not just a one-time effort. It is something, again, that needs to be continuously improving as well. So in conclusion, really, as Tony mentioned, TAPA is now putting a lot of effort into improving these two critical areas, and we had the first pilot training earlier this week. And as Tony mentioned, there's going to be, towards the end of the year, also a business continuity standard with training, with all the elements of a standard and educative effort to actually help you to improve in these areas. So I would just say, make use of these to the maximum. And the more you can make use of them in a collaborative manner, the better we're all going to be. Because supply chains are very connected, very independent systems. So the weakest link actually can break us all if we're not all in this together. So with that, I just thank you and hope you have a good day. I know you will be hearing a lot about these topics soon, both today and tomorrow. This was my contribution to the discussion. Thank you very much. Terima kasih.